Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're looking at something pretty fundamental to teaching, especially for all you future TESOL folks out there. We're going to be talking about course books, and more specifically, how to make them feel a bit less like they were written by robots. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. It's like sometimes those course books, they're made for this perfect student that doesn't actually exist.
Right. But the thing is, most of us have to use them, at least to some extent. So the question is, how do we take these sometimes kind of clunky course books, and how do we make them feel more, I don't know, more human, more connected to our students and, their lives and experiences and all that?
Well, and that's where this whole idea of humanizing course books comes in. It's really about remembering that our learners, they're not just empty vessels waiting to be filled with grammar rules. They're people with thoughts and feelings and experiences, right? And the more we can tap into that, the more effective our teaching is going to be.
Okay, so that makes sense in theory, but
Yeah.
how do we actually do that? I mean, can we really just rip up the textbook and say, okay, everybody, let's go learn English from YouTube videos?
Well, some teachers have literally done that. Brian Tomlinson, he's like one of the big names in this field of humanizing materials, right?
Okay.
He actually tells this story about a night school class he was teaching in Liverpool,
Oh, okay.
where he did just that.
Wait, seriously? He had them throw their course books out the window.
Yeah.
All right, you got to give me the details on this one.
So picture this, right? Cold night in Liverpool, classroom full of students. They're all kind of struggling to connect with the material. And Tomlinson's just like, you know what? Enough is enough. Has the whole class line up by the window, course books in hand. And on his signal, out they go.
Wow, that's quite the image. But what happened after that? Did they all just, stare at their empty desks for the rest of the class?
No, not quite. See, the point wasn't to, reject learning altogether. It was to reject materials that weren't working for them. So instead of those textbooks, he had them bring in things they actually enjoyed. Things like comics or magazines, their favorite books even.
So they went from these dry textbooks to things they were actually interested in reading in their free time.
Yep.
I bet that made a huge difference in their motivation to actually, engage with the language.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a really important lesson for future teachers like yourself, thinking about your students' needs and interests when you're choosing materials, or even just thinking about ways to adapt the materials you have to make them more relevant.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But I imagine some people listening might be thinking, well, sure, that's easy to say if you're teaching a general English class. But what about those of us who are going to be teaching something more specialized, like ESP or EAP? Those course books can feel even more, rigid and inflexible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There is sometimes this perception that, ESP or EAP learners, they just need the hard facts. The most efficient way to learn the language they need for their specific field, no time for messing around with stories and poems and things.
Right.
But actually, Tomlinson, he argues that even these learners, they crave those things too. They crave stories, poems, things that connect with them on a personal level, just like any other learner.
So even in a technical field, we shouldn't forget that we're teaching human beings.
Exactly. And he actually has some great examples of how he's done this, humanized deceit materials. So for instance, instead of just doing a boring old minimal pair drill,
Yeah.
he would weave those sounds into a funny little story about something local, something his students could relate to.
That's great.
Make it more memorable.
It shows you can be creative and engaging without sacrificing the learning objectives.
Exactly. And he also encouraged students to personalize the content a lot. Like, one example, instead of having them just describe a typical day at university, he asked them to imagine they were an animal from a previous activity
Okay.
and then describe their day from that animal's perspective.
Oh, I love that. So instead of I go to the library, it's like I sniff around for books and chase squirrels in the quad.
Exactly. It brings in that humor, that imagination, and it really gets them using the language in a more creative way.
That's brilliant. I'm already getting so many ideas just from hearing these examples.
Yeah, there are really endless possibilities for adapting course books. You can make small tweaks, you can design whole new activities, and Tomlinson has all these great examples from real classrooms, stuff that can really inspire you as you're starting out as a teacher.
Okay, so we've talked about the why behind humanizing course books, and we've gotten a few glimpses of the how. But I'm really eager to dive deeper into those specific strategies. What are some things that, pre-service teachers, people who are just starting their TESOL journey, what can they actually do to make those course books come alive for their students?
Well, one really powerful approach is to encourage student-led learning. Remember that teacher in Jakarta, the one who had her students finding their own English text?
Oh, yeah, that was such a cool example. They basically became curriculum designers.
Right. And you can do that on a smaller scale too, you know? Even if you're required to use a specific course book, you can still empower your students to go out and find supplementary materials that they find interesting.
So it's not just relying on the textbook, it's tapping into their interests, letting them bring their own world into the classroom.
Exactly. And that can lead to some really amazing discussions and learning opportunities. And speaking of tapping into students' interests, what about those times when, you're stuck with a text that just feels a little bit, well, dull, uninspiring? You know what I mean?
Yeah, those textbook passages that make you want to yawn just looking at them.
Exactly. Are there ways to, even make those come alive a bit?
That's a good question, because I feel like we've all been there. You open the book and it's like, oh, great, another paragraph about the history of pencil manufacturing.
Right. But even then, even with those kind of blow texts, there are ways to make them more engaging. One technique Tomlinson suggests is having students actually act out the text.
Ooh, I like that. Get them up and moving. They have to really think about what's going on, the emotions behind the words.
Exactly. It's not just reading the words on the page anymore. They're becoming the characters, bringing the story to life. And you can even take it a step further. Have them compare their acted version to the original text. See what choices they made, how their interpretation maybe differed from the writers.
That's a great way to bring in some critical thinking. And it's something pre-service teachers can even practice right now, with their classmates.
Exactly. And another technique that's really useful, especially for pre-service teachers, is having students draw visuals of the text before they even read it.
Oh, interesting. So instead of just giving them the text, you're having them use their imaginations first.
Right. They can activate their prior knowledge, maybe make predictions about the content, and all of that can help their comprehension when they actually do get to the reading.
I can see how that would be really helpful for visual learners too.
Absolutely.
Plus, it's just more fun and creative.
Now, this next strategy Tomlinson talks about, it's a little bit more, I guess you could say, mischievous. It's having students subvert a text.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that mean?
So it's basically taking a text and rewriting it from a totally different perspective. Let's say your course book has a text about, I don't know, the happiest woman in Japan.
Okay.
You could have your students rewrite it from the perspective of, a sumo wrestler.
Uh-huh.
Or a robot.
Huh.
Or even a talking cat.
I love that. It's just so unexpected. Plus, it lets them play with the language, be creative.
Exactly. It's taking something that could be boring and turning it into a fun activity. And they're still developing their language skills.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about adapting materials that we're given. But what about designing our own course books from scratch? Is there a way to make them more human, more engaging from the very beginning?
Oh, absolutely. Tomlinson's a big advocate for this. He suggests that course books should be written by, these diverse teams, bringing in educators, writers, artists, even poets.
I love that idea. It's like assembling this super group of creative minds.
Right. Each person brings their own expertise, their own passion.
And he even mentions having a chief examiner on the team.
Yeah, to make sure the material aligns with assessment goals.
So you've got that creative energy, but it's still grounded in those practical needs.
Exactly. And Tomlinson's also a big proponent of something called the text-driven approach to coursebook design.
Okay, I haven't heard that term before.
So it basically means starting with a text that you think will be really engaging for your students, and then building your lessons and activities around that.
So instead of starting with okay, we need to teach the present perfect,
Yeah.
let's find a text that uses the present perfect.
Right, which often leads to these really contrived examples.
Exactly.
The text-driven approach flips that. You start with meaningful content, and then you pull out the language points that are relevant.
That makes so much more sense. It's a much more organic way to approach things.
And Tomlinson actually takes this idea even further with something he calls a multidimensional approach to learning.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
So the idea is that we're not just cognitive beings, processing information. We're emotional beings. We have imaginations. We have physical bodies. And a truly humanistic coursebook would engage all of those dimensions.
So it's not just about appealing to the intellect. It's about engaging the whole learner.
Exactly.
That means incorporating activities that tap into things like affect, mental imagery, inner speech, physical activity, all those things.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of how that might actually look in a coursebook?
Sure. So instead of just having a dry dialogue about ordering food at a restaurant, imagine a course book that asks learners to think about their own most memorable dining experiences. What did they eat? Who were they with? How did it make them feel?
That's such a more powerful way to get those vocabulary words and grammar structures to stick.
Right. It's not just abstract concepts anymore. It's tied to their own lives.
And instead of just reading a description of a place.
The course book could guide them to create a vivid mental image of that place, engage their imaginations.
I love that.
And then to take it even further, the course book could have activities where students use their inner voice to practice the language silently.
Oh, yeah. That's a technique I use all the time.
It's like having a dress rehearsal in your mind.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't forget about physical activity. Tomlinson talks about getting students out of their seats, interacting with the language in a more physical way, whether that's through miming, role-playing, even things like cooking.
It's about making language learning a more embodied experience.
Exactly.
This whole multidimensional approach is so exciting.
It really is. And it's something pre-service teachers can really embrace as they're developing their own teaching styles.
So we've talked about adapting existing texts, designing new materials, but let's be real. A lot of TESOL teachers, especially when they're first starting out, they're going to be working with those big global course books, and those can sometimes feel, I don't know, pretty generic.
Yeah, like they're not really connected to the students' lives.
Exactly.
And that's where this idea of localization comes in.
Okay, so how do we take those global course books and make them feel more local?
Well, one strategy is to just look for opportunities to replace or supplement the existing texts with things that are more locally relevant.
So like if the course book has a text about a holiday that my students don't even celebrate,
Right?
I could swap it out for a text about a local festival or something.
Exactly.
Or if the book is talking about some global issue,
Mhm.
maybe I could bring in articles from local newspapers or websites.
That's a great way to make it more relatable. Show how these global issues are playing out in their own communities.
Another strategy is to have the students themselves localize the material.
Oh, I love that.
So they're not just passively receiving the information.
Right. They're actively shaping it, making it their own.
So maybe the course book has a dialogue set in, like a generic restaurant.
Yeah.
I could challenge my students to rewrite that dialogue using local slang, maybe regional dialects, even cultural references that are specific to their community.
That's a fun way to get them thinking about language variation, too.
And it's not just about adapting the content.
Right.
We can also think about localizing the learning activities themselves.
So, for example, imagine a coursebook activity where students have to write a letter of complaint.
Cool.
Instead of having them write to some generic company, they could write to a local authority figure about an issue that's affecting their community.
So they could write to the mayor about the need for more green spaces,
Hmm.
or to the school board about improving the cafeteria food.
Exactly. It just makes the writing task more authentic, more purposeful.
I'm loving all these ideas.
It really is empowering, this whole concept of localization.
It lets us move beyond those generic textbooks and create learning experiences that are truly meaningful for our students.
And Tomlinson actually suggests that publishers could even help with this, by providing teachers with a bank of resources that can be easily adapted for different contexts.
So instead of just having one global edition, they could offer all of these different materials.
Right.
And teachers could mix and match to create something that's perfect for their students.
Exactly.
That would be amazing.
It would give teachers so much more flexibility and control.
It seems like there's a real movement towards making coursebooks more responsive to the needs of diverse learners.
There really is.
And technology is playing a huge role in that, too.
Absolutely. Digital platforms are opening up all sorts of possibilities for personalization, localization, creative adaptation.
I mean, teachers can create their own online materials. They can incorporate local content, customize activities.
And learners themselves can access all these amazing resources, connect with other learners from around the world, even create their own content.
It's like the walls of the traditional classroom are just disappearing.
In a way, yeah.
Learners have access to this global learning community.
And they're becoming more active participants in their own education.
This has been such a great conversation.
I really enjoyed it.
We've covered so much ground, from the theory behind humanizing coursebooks to really practical strategies for adapting and designing materials.
And I think the key takeaway, especially for pre-service teachers, is that you have the power to make those coursebooks come alive.
You don't have to be limited by the textbook.
Right.
You could be creative, innovative, even a little bit rebellious if you want.
You can tap into the hearts and minds of your students.
Make learning not just effective, but enjoyable,
Right.
meaningful.
Ultimately transformative.
And that brings us to the most important question.
Mm-hmm.
What are you going to do with all of this?
Yeah.
We've been given all these amazing ideas, all these tools for making course books better. And now it's like, okay, what are we going to actually do with them?
Yeah, that's the exciting part. It's not just about, using the tools. It's about really understanding why they work. Like, why are emotions so important in learning? Why is
Yeah.
personal experience so powerful? How can we as teachers, especially new teachers, how can we tap into all of that?
And I don't think there's one right answer to that.
Yeah,
It's going to be different for every teacher, every group of students.
absolutely. It's about experimenting, trying new things, seeing what works.
And that's where your TESOL training comes in. You're learning all these different methods, different approaches.
And all of that can help you make decisions about how to adapt materials, how to design your own activities.
So it's not just about like following a recipe.
Right.
You have to be thoughtful, intentional. Think about your students' needs, their learning style.
And the context you're teaching in.
All of that matters.
And remember, even small changes can make a big difference. You don't have to completely reinvent the wheel every time you teach.
Right.
Sometimes it's just adding a little personal touch, a bit of humor, a connection to the students' lives.
And that can be enough to make the learning more meaningful.
Absolutely.
I think that's really encouraging for new teachers.
Yeah.
It can feel overwhelming when you're first starting out,
There's so much to learn.
but knowing that even small steps can have an impact.
That's really powerful.
And as you gain more experience,
You'll start to develop your own style, your own go-to strategies.
but the most important thing is to never forget about the human element.
Oh, that's so true.
It's easy to get caught up in the textbooks, the lesson plans, all of that.
But at the end of the day, it's about connecting with your students, inspiring them, helping them grow.
That's what makes teaching so special.
It really is.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up.
I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground today. But hopefully you're leaving this deep dive feeling inspired, ready to make those course books work for you and your students.
And don't be afraid to get creative, to try new things.
Your students will thank you for it.
Happy teaching, everyone.
See you next time.